Hello students, today we will discuss about auditory pathway. So what is auditory pathway? Now when you will see the auditory pathway, it is having the two part. The first part is extracranial and the another is the intracranial. So when you will see that the sound wave, it travels from the ear and then it will ultimately pass through the vestibulocochlear nerve and then it will enter into the brain stem and the different part of the brains, and ultimately it will relay into the primary auditory cortex. So when you will have the question on auditory pathway, or whenever you are reading the auditory pathway, we will first read how the sound wave is converted into the electric wave, and then those impulses of electric wave carried by the vestibulocochlear nerve and ultimately relay into the primary auditory cortex. So first we will start with the extracranial part of auditory pathway. Now, as we all know that the sound waves are actually the air waves. Sound waves are the air waves. So how to write this? So we'll make a flow chart. So we'll have the sound wave. Now the sound waves are the air waves, and these waves enters into the external acoustic meatus. Now on the lateral end of external acoustic meatus, you have the tympanic membrane. Now this tympanic membrane inside is having the three ear ossicles, malleus, incus and stapes. So the sound wave enters into the external acoustic meatus. These sound waves are the air waves. These are the air waves. Now these air waves pass through the external acoustic meatus and they will reach to the tympanic membrane. Now there is a vibration of the tympanic membrane, and these vibration then transmit to these bones, malleus, incus and stapes. Now this is important to understand that what will happen here, the frequency of sound wave is increased by 20 times, by the help of these three bones and the shape of tympanic membrane. What does it means? That when we are talking about the transmission of the sound wave, we are going to convert the air wave into the fluid wave. We are going to convert the waves which are present in the air to the waves those are present in the fluid. Now this fluid is present in the inner ear, and that is known as perilymph. So to produce the waves into the liquid, we need to amplify the frequency of these waves. Otherwise what will happen, that if the same frequency wave will reach to this fluid, the frequency will decrease to a maximum level. That quality of the sound is not heard. So to maintain that, we have to increase the frequency, and this frequency is increased by two factors. First is the relative size changes or relative size difference between the tympanic membrane and oval window, and second is these three bones, malleus, incus and stapes. So these are the two factors which are responsible to increase the to prevent this decrease in the frequency. So how they will do is that this tympanic membrane, this is the tympanic membrane, this is your external acoustic meters. Here you will have, this is the malleus, this is the handle, this is the incus, and you will have the stapes. So these are the three bones. Now what will happen that when you can see that this stapes later on will go and attach on this oval window. Now here you can see that this is the tympanic membrane and this is the oval window. So this is the first factor, that there is a change in the size of your two windows or the two membranes. Now this membrane is larger in the size and it is receiving the large amount of the air waves, and these waves are then transmitting to the small size membrane. So because the number of the waves those are coming here will transmit to this small area, so the frequency will increase because the number will not change, but because the size is changing, so the frequency will increase. The second thing is that the vibration of these bones. Now when there is a vibration occurs between the malleus, incus and stapes, these will also increase the frequency. So now what will happen that this stapes then will show the vibration, and it will vibrate like this. Now it will push this oval window, and inside this oval window you have the fluid is known as perilymph. You have the fluid is known as perilymph. So what is the things which we have seen into this flow chart, that there is a airborne sound waves. These waves enters into the external acoustic meatus, then on the medial end of external acoustic meatus you have the tympanic membrane, then tympanic membrane transmit these to the malleus, incus and stapes, then foot of stapes it will attach to the oval window where you will have the membrane. Now I will give you the brief idea about the cochlea. What is that cochlea? Now what is cochlea? Now cochlea is a bony structure, and it is a structure which is having the spiral fold. Now this cochlea is a tube. It is a tube. It is a tube which is having such kind of the fold like this. It is a fold like structure. Now if you will take a section of this tube, you are going to see that this tube is having a axis is known as modulus. It is having a axis is known as modulus. Now from the modulus you are having the two membranes which are dividing this tube into the three areas. Now what are these areas? This is known as scala vestibuli. This is known as scala tympani, and this is known as scala media, or it is also known as cochlear duct, or it is also known as cochlear duct. So now here you will have, in both these areas you will have the liquid is known as perilymph. We will have the separate lecture in which we will discuss the detail of this cochlea. So for this auditory pathway you have to just remember one thing, that this scala vestibuli is having a small window, and that is known as oval window, and that window is towards the middle ear, and from the middle ear the foot of stapes will go and fix on that oval window. Now when the vibration is produced by the foot of stapes, those vibration ultimately produce the waves into this fluid. So that is conversion of your sound air waves into the fluid waves, and that is possible because of the oval window here. Plus this scala tympani is also having its projection into the middle ear through the round window. And this window is compulsory for the production of waves into this fluid. Okay? So what will happen next into this flow chart, that foot stapes vibrates, and these vibration will enter into the scala. These vibration from the oval window will enter into the scala vestibuli, and it will generate the waves into the perilymph. Now what next? Now if you will see again this cross section of cochlea, you are able to see that this is divided into the three parts, as I already told you. Now this partition is known as vestibular membrane. This is known as vestibular membrane, and this is known as basilar membrane. This is known as basilar membrane. So now what will happen next, that whatever the waves are here into this perilymph, these waves will vibrate this membrane. These waves of the perilymph vibrates the vestibular membrane. Now this vestibular membrane transmits these waves into the liquid which is present here into the cochlear duct or scala media, and this fluid is known as endolymph. This fluid is known as endolymph. So what will happen, that these vibrations are vibrating this vestibular membrane, and with the help of the vibration in vestibular membrane, the impulses or the waves now produced into the endolymph. Now in this endolymph, on this basilar membrane, you have the receptor, and that receptor is known as organ of Corti. That receptor is known as organ of Corti. So what will happen, that this is the waves which are in the endolymph, now transmit those waves to this basilar membrane. So what happened? First, the vibrations from the foot of stapes transmit to the oval window. From the oval window, they will transmit to the scala vestibuli, where the waves will generate into the perilymph. Now these waves will vibrate the vestibular membrane. Then because of the vibration of vestibular membrane, the vibration transmit inside into the endolymph. Now these endolymph vibration will transmit to the basement membrane, basilar membrane, and on the basilar membrane we have the organ of Corti. So ultimately what will happen, that the vibrations of the basilar membrane stimulate this organ of Corti. Now when you will see the organ of Corti, in the organ of Corti you have the hair cells. You have the hair cells which are known as stereocilia. So what will happen, that and this stereocilia remain fixed into one more layer of the substance is known as membrana tectoria. So if you will see the structure here, what will happen, that this is your basilar membrane. Now above the basilar membrane, suppose this is your hair cell. This is your organ of Corti. Now this stereocilia is remain embedded into a membrane, one more membrane is here, it is known as membrana tectoria. That is known as membrana tectoria. Now this tectorial membrane is very less mobile. This is almost a fixed structure. This part is fixed or it is very less mobile. And these kinocilium, these hairs, these cilia or stereocilia are embedded into this tectorial membrane. So now what will happen, that the perilymph stimulates the vestibular membrane stimulates the endolymph stimulates the basilar membrane, and the vibrations in the basilar membrane will cause the displacement of these cells. The vibration will displace these cells, and because of the displacement of the cell, and the hairs are fixed but the cells are moving, so it will lead to the deformation of hair cells. And because these are receptors, so because of the deformation they will depolarize, and because of the depolarization of the hair cells, your mechanical energy now has been converted into the electric impulse, and these hair cells are connected with the dendrites of the neurons which are present in the cochlear, ganglia, spiral ganglia. Clear? So if you will complete this flow chart, what will happen, that these waves produces the vibration into the perilymph. They will produce, this is transmitted into the perilymph. Now this perilymph will stimulate the vestibular membrane. It will stimulate the vestibular membrane. This perilymph stimulates the vestibular membrane. Then the vestibular membrane will transmit these vibrations to the endolymph. Now endolymph produces the vibration in basilar membrane. Now because of the movement of basilar membrane, what will happen, that there is a movement of, you can say movement, or it is also known as deformation of organ of Corti's organ, and because of this hair cells, basically because of the deformation, there is a depolarization in the cells of organ of Corti, which are the receptors actually, and these depolarization then ultimately transmit to the your neurons, first order neurons, which are first order, and these neurons are located into the ganglia, and this ganglia is known as spiral ganglia. This ganglia is known as spiral ganglia. So that is what is about this pathway, and from the spiral ganglia you will have the cochlear nerve, and this cochlear nerve joins the vestibular part and form the vestibulocochlear nerve, and this vestibulocochlear nerve later on enters into the internal acoustic meatus and enter into the cranial cavity. So when you will see the extracranial part of your auditory pathway, it starts from the sound waves, and these sound waves are actually waves which are present in the air, and they will enter into the ear by the pinna and external acoustic meatus, where it will vibrate the tympanic membrane, and inside the middle ear the amplification is required because we want to change the air wave into the liquid waves. So there is a 20 times increase in the frequency by the two factors, vibration of the malleus incus stapes and because of the relative change in the size of tympanic membrane and membrane of oval window. Then this first foot of stapes articulate with the oval window, and the vibrations will transmit from oval window to the scala vestibuli, where you will have the perilimb. So wave will generate into the perilimb. These waves or vibrations will transmit to the vestibular membrane transmit them to the endolymph, which is present in the cochlear duct. Inside the cochlear duct there is a vibration occurs in the basilar membrane, and on the basilar membrane we have the organ of Corti that is acting as a receptor for the hearing, and that movement of the basilar membrane causes change into the shape of the hair cells, and because of that there is a depolarization occurs in these cells, and these are the receptors. So they are having the peripheral process of the neurons which are present into the spiral ganglia. So ultimately the sound wave first convert into the fluid wave, and then fluid wave will convert into the electric wave, and now it will pass from the spiral ganglia to the cochlear nerve, and this cochlear nerve ultimately enters into the cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus, and that is known as vestibulocochlear nerve. So this is what is about the extracranial part of the auditory pathway. Now we'll discuss the central pathway. Now when you will see the central pathway of auditory impulses, it starts from the cochlear nuclei. It starts from the cochlear nuclei. Now when you will see the overall pathway, you are having the first order, second order, third order, and sometimes fourth order neurons in this pathway. Now the first order neurons are present into the cochlear ganglia. Now this cochlear ganglia is also known as spiral ganglia, and this spiral ganglia is present into the cochlea. But the unusual thing about this cochlear ganglia, that generally when we will have the ganglia, we are having the collection of neuronal cells head, but here we are having the thick bony area here which is known as modulus, and inside this modulus we are having the small gaps, and these gaps are the bubble like gaps. These are the bubble like gaps, and in these gaps we will have the collection of, we will have the individual nerve head of those neurons. So in this cochlear ganglia, what is unusual? The unusual thing is that it is not a collection of neuronal head at one place. It is actually the scattered neuronal heads, and these scattered neuronal heads are present into the bubble like spaces into this bony part of this cochlea. So this is act as a first order neuron. Now these first order neuron give the central process, and these central process will form the cochlear nerve, and this cochlear nerve enters into the cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus. Now the second order neuron is cochlear nuclei neuron. Now this cochlear nuclei is present into the pons lower part, which are ventral and dorsal. Now the ventral nuclei is larger in size, and these are the main nuclei. The dorsal nuclei is smaller in size. Then you will have the third order neurons, and these third order neuron arises from the superior olivary complex. Superior olivary complex. So the neurons which are present into the olivary complex will synapse the neurons of the cochlear nuclei, and they will give rise to the third order neuron. Now these third order neuron will go to the auditory cortex. They will go to the auditory cortex. Now what is the fourth order neuron? Now these fourth order neurons arises from the nuclei of lateral lemniscus. Nuclei of lateral lemniscus. Some of the neurons of superior olivary complex will go and synapse into the nuclei of lateral lemniscus, and then from here you will have the fibers projecting to the auditory cortex. So when we will see the pathway of this auditory impulses, we are having the first order neuron which are present in the cochlear ganglia or the spiral ganglia. Second order neurons are present into the cochlear nuclei, which is present into the pons lower part, and the third order neurons are present into the superior olivary complex. So these are the main important thing which you have to remember. Then what will happen, how this pathway will go? For that you have to remember first the name of the relay stations in the brain, and these structures are mainly included the area of the pons, midbrain, thalamus and cerebral cortex. So what is these areas? Now these areas are in the pons. We are going to deal with the cochlear nuclei, which are ventral and dorsal. Then as it will ascend into the upper pons and the midbrain, you have the lateral lemniscus, and you will have the olivary complex, superior olivary complex. So these are the two things. Then you will have inferior colliculus, which is a very important component of the midbrain. Then you will have, it will go to the medial geniculate body, which is the part of the thalamus, and from here it will ultimately reach to the auditory cortex. So how to keep this thing in mind? So for that we have a mnemonic, and that is known as E. coli. E. coli is actually a organism, bacteria, which is present into the stomach, and iske you have the suffix ma, E. coli ma. So what is the full form of this? E is start from the 8th cranial nerve nuclei, 8th cranial nerve ganglia. Then you will have the cochlear ganglia, cochlear nuclei. Then you will have superior olivary. So C stand for this cochlear nuclei, O stand for the superior olivary complex, L stand for the lateral lemniscus, I stand for the inferior colliculus, M stand for the medial geniculate body, and A stand for the auditory cortex. So to keep the sequence, you have to remember that these are the part which is inside the brain stem. What are they? Cochlear nuclei, olivary complex, lateral lemniscus and inferior colliculus. So these are the four components which you are going to see into the midbrain and the pons. So now we will discuss what are the important fibers, name of the important fibers. So what will happen, that you will have the cochlear nerve. Now this cochlear nerve is carrying the first order neuron. Those will relay into the cochlear nuclei. Now cochlear nuclei are two, ventral and dorsal. Now these ventral nuclei give rise to a trapezoid body. It give rise to the fibers, those will form a structure is known as trapezoid body. You can also see this trapezoid body in this diagram. Now this diagram is showing, this is the ventral part of the pons where you are able to see the trapezoid body, and here on the posterior side you can see the ventral and dorsal cochlear nuclei. Now this trapezoid body is actually formed by the fibers, those are arising from the ventral cochlear nuclei, and they will show the decussation. There is a decussation of these fibers. Now what will happen, that this is the fibers of, this is our cochlear ventral right side and the left side. Now the fibers, those are arising from the right will go to the left, from the left will go to the right, and they will go like this, and this area is known as trapezoid body, and these fibers are known as ventral acoustic stria. What is the actual name for this trapezoid body? Ventral acoustic stria. Ventral acoustic stria. Now what is ventral acoustic stria? Ventral acoustic stria means the fibers which are arising from the cochlear nuclei, these are representing the second order neurons, and they are showing the decussation into the ventral part of the pons, and this is known as trapezoid body. So this is formed by the ventral cochlear nuclei fibers. The fibers which are arising from the dorsal will form the dorsal acoustic stria, and these fibers are run along with the floor of fourth ventricle, and they will go to the opposite side and they will relay into the olivary complex. They will relay into the olivary complex. So where they will go? They will go to the olivary complex, superior olivary complex. Now from this superior olivary complex, the fiber go to the lateral, form the bundle is known as lateral lemniscus, and in the lateral lemniscus itself, sometimes you have the collection of the neurons which are known as nuclei of lateral lemniscus, which are known as nuclei of lateral lemniscus. So some fibers will relay into that lateral lemniscus, otherwise the fibers from the olivary complex will go to the inferior colliculus. So these olivary complex fibers will work as a third order neuron. Now from the inferior colliculus, the fibers will go to the medial geniculate body, and the bundle is now known as inferior brachium. That bundle of fibers from inferior colliculus to the medial geniculate body is known as inferior brachium, and from the medial geniculate body the fibers will go through the sublentiform part of internal capsule. These fibers will ultimately relay into the primary auditory cortex, and this primary auditory cortex is Brodmann's area number 41, that is present into the superior temporal gyrus deep to the lateral sulcus, and this is also known as the gyrus of Herschel. So that is what is about the primary auditory cortex, and it also connected with the secondary cortex, auditory cortex, area number 42. So what is the central pathway of the auditory impulses? That the first order neuron comes from the cochlear ganglia through the cochlear nerve, that will relay into the cochlear nuclei. From the cochlear nuclei we have the fibers, those will go into the olivary complex. From the olivary complex the fibers will go into the lateral lemnisci. From the lateral lemniscus, it will end into the inferior colliculus. The fibers will reach to the medial geniculate body by the inferior brachium, and medial geniculate body will reach to the auditory cortex by the sublentiform part of internal capsule. So this is how you can write in the exam about the central part of the auditory pathway. So we have seen that there is a bilateral representation of both the ear, but it is only seen above the second order neurons. That means if we will see the first order neurons, now this is the one side ear, this is the another side. The first order neurons are actually the cochlear nerve itself, and these cochlear nerve are coming from the unilateral side, and from the second order, that means the cochlear nuclei onwards, there is a decussation of the fibers occurs, and the fibers are going to the ipsilateral side and also receiving from the contralateral side. So second order neurons, if there is an injury occurs in the one side of the part, will not have the deafness because of the bilateral representation. But for the complete deafness in the lower part, you will have to compromise both the cochlear nerve. So this is the important thing, that whenever we are talking about the injury, if there is a unilateral injury into the brain stem, then the hearing is not affected because of the bilateral presentation. But in the lower part, that means in the region of the first order neuron, there is no such crossing occurs. So if we will have the injury, that will lead to the unilateral deafness of the ear. So this is what is about the important thing which you have to always keep in mind. The second thing is that whenever there is a noisy sound or there is a very excessive high volume sound enters into the ear, there is a reflex contraction occurs of the stapedius and tensor tympani muscle, and that will dampen the sound and it will protect our ear, and that is known as sound attenuation reflex. That is known as sound attenuation reflex. Now how this reflex work? Now this is your cochlear nerve. Now this, as soon as the sound enters into the ear, as soon as the sound enters into the one ear, this side of cochlear nerve will stimulate and it will send the fibers to the cochlear nuclei into the pons, mainly the ventral cochlear nuclei. Now this ventral cochlear nuclei project to the both of your olivary complex. It project to the both olivary complex, ipsilateral as well as contralateral, right and left sides of the olivary complex by the trapezoid body, and this olivary complex is having connection with the motor nuclei of facial nerve and trigeminal nerve, with the facial nerve and trigeminal nerve. And as we know that this facial nerve will supply the stapedius and the trigeminal nerve will supply the tensor tympani. So what will happen, that it will cause the contraction of the stapedius, and this contraction of the stapedius dampens the vibrating effect of the foot of stapes on the oval window. In the same way, because of the tensioning of the tympanic membrane, the tympanic membrane vibration will also decrease and the transmission of the waves from the external acoustic meatus to the malleus is decreased. So ultimately, by doing these two mechanisms, we are actually dampening the excessive amount of the air waves which are entering into the ear, and this is known as sound attenuation reflex, which is a protective mechanism and it prevents the damage of the ear for the noisy sound. So this is all about the auditory pathway. Thanks for watching this video.